Okay, this morning we're looking at a very appropriate title, a work ethic. Have you ever heard of a work ethic? I think it's a word or a phrase that we don't hear too much about in our culture today. But there still is such a thing as a work ethic, and I think as we look through the Old and the New Testament, we see a lot that deals with work and the value of it and the honor in it and the dignity of work. And so that's what we're going to look at. I have too many scriptures this morning to read them all, so I'm going to read them as I go through the message today. So I'll try to give you time to look them up, but I can't read them all in the open. There's just too many here. So tomorrow is Labor Day, isn't it? Tomorrow's Labor Day. It's a holiday. We've been talking about that the last few through this morning here. And so what I want us to do is I want us to consider what God expects of us when we're at work. What are we expected? What does God expect? You know, not just our employer. Sometimes we worry about the employer or our co-workers or whatever. What do they expect from us? But what does God expect? What we do 40 hours or more a week, whether it's at home or maybe in school or on the job, I really believe as we look at Scripture, we see that it does matter to God. It's a big thing to God. He cares about what we do on our work in our work time. So I decided to begin with a little bit of what the Apostle Paul wrote in one of his prison epistles as he wrote from a prison in Philippi. He was imprisoned there for nothing more than just preaching the gospel. All he did was preach the gospel, and they put him in prison. If we look at Philippians 1:27, it says, Paul's telling the church at Philippi, above all else, you must live in a way that brings honor to the good news about Christ. Then whether I visit you or not, I will hear that all of you think alike. I will know that you are working together and that you are struggling side by side to get others to believe in the good news. Paul had a passion, I think that's an understatement, for missions, for reaching the world with the good news of Jesus Christ. That was his passion through all his epistles, through all of his missionary journeys, and so forth. But look again at that first sentence that he wrote here in this passage in verse 27 of Philippians 1. He said, above all things. So he's stressing something very critical to here. He says, above all things, you must live in a way that brings honor to the good news about Christ. I really believe that if Paul were here today, he might say it this way: above all else, your example must be better than what usually is seen. We see a lot of examples that are poor examples of people in the workplace, of people in service, and going about the day-to-day lives. He's saying that our example has to be better than what we're seeing. We have to go the extra mile. We have to go some extra lengths to work together so that people will be amazed by how you live and they will believe the good news and turn to God. That's what he's saying. They will turn to God because of how we live and what our example is. So let me ask you the question. I had to ask myself this. Do you feel that way? It's important that you do, because when you feel that your work matters to God, if we really comprehend that our work matters to God, we'll have a sense of pride and purpose about our work. You know, our work, our vocation, if you will, is more than just something we put in 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or whatever. It has a purpose that God wants us to fulfill in our day-to-day lives. No matter what that work that may be that you do, what God has called you to do, you will have an inner motivation to do well if we understand that concept that God cares about what we do. On the other hand, if we feel like our work doesn't matter to God, that he's not really interested in it, that he's not really concerned about what you do, then you'll find it a lot easier to just let things slide, to compromise, to make moral compromises. You might say, hey, it really doesn't matter if I lie or I come in late or whether I work hard or not. It's only a job. And besides that, they probably should be paying me more anyway. That's the thinking that I think in our secularized society has become way too prevalent. But as Christians, we should see our vocation differently than that. As I was thinking about the title of my message here, work ethics. Work ethics. It caused me to go down a little bit of a rabbit trail as I was thinking about that. And I started to think about those old Zane Grey books. Did anybody ever read Zane Grey when we were kids? You know, nowadays we got internet and all that. But the old days they had the Zane Grey Western books. They weren't foul language in that. They were just good wholesome reading. And some of us older people would remember that. But they were cowboy books, I guess you'd call them. They were about cowboys, and there were a lot of movies when we were kids. I remember the Cisco Kid and Lone Ranger and all these westerns, you know, Bonanza, and you know, younger people there, you probably don't relate to that like we did. But that's all we watched was westerns back in those days. And in some of the best of them, the main character would always seem to be what? He'd wear what kind of hat would he have? He'd have the white hat, and the bad guy would wear the black hat, and the white guy had a code. He would have a code of ethics. Let's put it that way. And we kind of took up on that in our thought process in those days when we were kids, that it was a cowboy code of ethics. And so a lot of characters in the story would either be on one side or the other, and you always knew who the bad guy was, and you always knew the good guy was the guy with the code of ethics. So in reality, you might ask, well, I mean, since we thought that much of it, is there really such a thing as a cowboy code of ethics? Well, I looked on the internet. Sure enough, there is a cowboy code of ethics. And here's what it says on there. Now, I was looking at, it was actually talked about in a book called Cowboy Ethics, What Wall Street Can Learn from the Code of the West. So it was the Code of the West, the Cowboy Ethics, What Wall Street Can Learn from it. And it was written by a guy named Jim Owen, if you want to look it up and see something interesting and for something to look at. But he made a real heartfelt case for a new approach to business ethics, or I would say something that we're relearning about ethics that the cowboys taught us when we were kids. One goes back to the simple, timeless principles like those of the Cowboy Code. He also translated the unwritten code of the West into what he called 10 principles to live by. So here was the code of the West that he picked up from all these cowboy movies and Zane Grey books and so forth. Number 1, live each day with courage. Number 2, when you make a promise, keep it. Number 3, take pride in your work. Number 4, ride for the brand. You ever heard that term? Has anybody here ever heard? Yeah, ride for the brand. Always finish what you start. Talk less and say more. Do what has to be done. Remember, some things aren't for sale. That's code 8. Some things aren't for sale. Be tough, but be fair. Number 10, know where to draw the line. And I think I could add a number 11 here in my own mind. In those old movies, at least, the good cowboy always takes off his hat in a church building. They had respect. You know, like we were kids, my wife just says, some of your shirts, Bill, you should leave them untucked because that's the style nowadays. I said, I just can't do it because I was always told, tuck in your shirt. So I have a hard time doing that. I might have any kind of shirt you can think of, but I want to tuck it in because that's the way we were taught. When we went into the church building or the school, you took the cap off. I think that's really important. And the reason they took their hat off, the cowboy did when he came into church, is because he recognized there was a higher power that he was honoring when he came in there. An ultimate boss before whom we all will stand. The article went on. This guy was writing, this Jim, whatever his name was. Jim,
Owen.
Jim Owen. See how I am? I have to have my brain. Anyway, Jim Owen's message struck a really deep chord with people from all walks of life. Cowboy ethics has become part of our national conversation, or at least that thought process has really become that. People all across our country are beginning to rediscover the cowboy code and make it their own. There's a movement going on in our country where people are saying enough is enough. Enough is enough of politically correctness. It's time to get real. We need to get real. But why cowboys? Why would you pick out a cowboy from Montana or Wyoming or Colorado or Oklahoma, wherever you got cowboys, and use that? Well, cowboys represented the very best of America all through those years when cowboys were really popular and really needed. We needed cowboys. They had courage. Cowboys had optimism. And they just did plain hard work. Not just because they do a dangerous job, but also because they stand for something. The simple, basic values that lie at the heart of the cowboy way. And I would say, and we could all agree with, their way of life has changed a lot over the last 150 years since the cattle drives and so forth. A lot of this part of Montana was settled by people that came up on cattle drives. All your Conleys and your, all those Irishmen come up here, the Sullivans and the Hugheses and the Buckleys up by Sweetgrass. They all came up here on the cattle drives. Didn't they, Victor? He's a Conley. Yeah, you can bet that your heritage is from one of those cattle drives. Exactly. And they came up and they had this code of ethics. They had a code of honor. We didn't have law and order in this state, but you had a code of ethics. Someone might say, through thick or thin, or through hell or high water, you're going to be faithful to your ethics. Do we see that much anymore? No, you got to have a band of lawyers to write up a contract for a car, or a house, or anything else. My first point this morning that I really want to zero in on is Christians should consider God is to be their ultimate boss. When you cut through the smoke screens, your ultimate boss is going to be God. It's going to be God. If you go right from the opening pages of the Bible, it's real obvious that God is a worker. You know that? God is the creator of the universe, but he works. He's a worker. How do I know that? Well, if you go to the very first words in the Bible, what does it say? In the beginning, God, what? Created the heavens and the earth. And then the Bible goes on to tell us that he created the sky and the water and the land and the trees and the mountains and the sun and the moon, the stars, the fish, the birds, the animals, and finally, what did he make? His crowning creation. He created a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and he became a living soul. The psalmist said in Psalm 104 better than I could ever say it. 104:24. Psalm 104 verse 24 says, Lord, you have made so many things. How wise you were when you made all of them. The earth is full of your creatures. Our God is a worker, and we, according to Genesis 1:26 and 27, as it says there, we are created in his image. Therefore, we should be workers too. Work is not a four-letter word. You remember that show, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis? Not many of you would remember that. That's an old show from the 60s. Work. Maynard G. Krebs. And Dobie said, hey, Maynard, don't you think you should get a job, go to work? And he'd go, work? It was a 4-letter word to Maynard Krebs. Yeah, he remembers. That's why God, after creating Adam, what did he do? Adam. He put him to work, didn't he? Mm-hmm. That was not a bad word. If you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, it says, the Lord God put the man in the Garden of Eden. He put him there to what? To farm its land and take care of it. By the way, Jesus, who's the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, was also a worker. Why do I know that? How can I be so emphatic to say that? Well, Jesus says in John 5:17, my Father is always doing his work. He is working right up to this day. I am working too. End quote. Jesus was a worker. He was a carpenter. He worked with his hands. He not only worked with his hands, he healed people with those hands. Listen to Mark 6:31. Many people were coming and going, so they did not even have a chance to eat. Then Jesus said to his apostles, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place. You need to get some rest. Sometimes work can be an end in itself if we're not really careful. Jesus told his disciples, let's go get some rest. Let's go get something to eat. Let's go get a bite to eat. Some people are workaholics. Do you know any workaholics? They just get so focused on working that that's all they do. And it's easy to fall into that trap. I need to spend more time at the office or at the shop or whatever. I need to spend another hour before I go. I need to get one more shift of overtime. I need to do another load of laundry. Maybe I need to take another phone call. One more project. Sometimes it's time to turn off the phone. And I do that sometimes now, a little bit more. Because it can wear you out. I get calls at 8 or 9 at night, you know. You think you could fix my car? I said, yeah, well, it's 9 o'clock at night. Can't you call me in the morning? Oh, I didn't realize that. You know, it can get to the point where you feel guilty if you take a break. And we shouldn't feel like that. We need a break sometimes. Sometimes you just need to get away. Where were you at? None of your business. I was tired. I was taking a nap. Listen, when you burn the candle at both ends, you're not as bright as you think you are. Okay? Yes, your work matters to God. And one reason your work matters to God is because that is where your faith really meets life. That's where your faith really touches the rubber on the road. So let's consider what happens at a lot of places of work in today's world. Well, for instance, it's not unusual for some workers to show up late. Do you ever have anybody show up late, James, at your business, where you're working? Okay, don't pick on the boss. He says the boss is late.
No, I said every day the employees are late. Except my friend.
Well, he might have a good reason, though. I do. Okay. Now, what's that, James?
No, I said every day.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, some people show up late. Maybe they don't even bother to call when they come in sick. You know, they don't come in. Or they call in sick when they're not really sick. Or they complain a lot. Some even develop the habit of not working as hard when the boss isn't around. Using time for personal stuff like phone calls, emails, surfing the net, putting in just the effort to get by. I think that's more of what we're seeing today, and I think that the biggest reason for that is we don't see God in our work. It's a way to make a paycheck, you know, and we shouldn't see it like that. God wants to be involved in our work. He wants to be active with us as we go through our work. I thought this was kind of cute. I ran across some suggestions on what to say to your boss if he catches you falling asleep on the job. So you can learn from this one here. Okay, the first thing, he caught the guy falling asleep, and he said, oh my goodness, boss. He said, they told me at the blood bank that this might happen. Or, boy, that cold medicine I took last night just didn't wear off. There's a good one. Here's the one I really like. It says, I wasn't really sleeping, boss. I was praying about you in the shop. That God would take care of you today. Well, I hope this isn't the kind of environment which you're working. But maybe it is. But I'm afraid some of what I've mentioned goes on in any workplace. So now, let's take a moment here. Let's turn to the 5th and 6th chapters of Paul's letter to the Christians at Ephesus, okay? He's talking to the church. He begins chapter 5 with these words. Chapter 5 of Ephesians. You are the children that God dearly loves. So here's what he says. So follow his example. Lead a life of love just as Christ did. Then he goes on to give advice to the Christians who will be reading his letter. To the congregation as a whole, then to wives, to husbands, to children, to fathers, and to slaves. You see the order. God put us guys at the top of the food chain in family relationships. Whether we like it or not, we're at the top. We have to be leaders. And then you got your wives and your children. And to slaves, and finally to masters. Now, let's be clear on this idea of slaves. You know, the Bible talks about slavery, but it wasn't slavery like it was during the time with the black people before the Civil War. It wasn't like that. Slaves were indentured servants. They were what you'd call bond servants of their masters. So if you had somebody that was really poor, he would indenture himself. He would be a bond servant of a guy that had money, and he would, in that sense, he would be told every move he makes. He would be controlled by that master. But the master was responsible to make sure he had food, clothing, every need that he had need of was met by the master. So it wasn't like someone that would own another human being. So let's get that clear. Now, when you're at work, we're not slaves. You might feel that way. If the boss is really hard on you, you might feel like a slave. But I guarantee, I'm not going to comment on it. I believe the basic principles apply to the employer-employee relationship, though. We treat each other with respect, whether we're an employee or an employer. That's so important. Students and teachers relationships today. We were talking about that in Sunday school a little bit about it. You know, like back in the day, you know, we might have got the paddle if we acted bad. Now you can't even discipline a child. And so it makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to be a teacher. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 and 7. Slaves, obey your masters here on earth. Respect them and honor them with a heart that is true. Obey them just as you would Christ. Don't obey them only to please them when they are watching. Do it because you are slaves of Christ. Serve your masters with all your heart. Work as serving the Lord and not as serving people, end quote. So the idea is that if we see our job in the right way, our employment, our vocation in the right way, we see the hand of God is in it. Everything that we do, God is in it. It may not matter to the people that you work with or even your customers, but if anyone cares about your work performance, it is your boss. The boss cares what you do. He's looking, you know, I have a little tiff with our people that I'm working with. You know, they look at what needs to be paid, but I said, just got to start looking at what's coming in to pay that with. You know, they'll throw out like 6 or 8 or 10 checks at me to sign. I said, yeah, but where's the money coming from to pay for them? Oh, we didn't pay any attention to them. You know, sometimes you got to look at the income side of the ledger too. So we have all these things that come together that have to be done. Your boss is always going to care about your performance. He's going to care about how you think. So whatever you do, manage your office, or whether you program computers, when you're pulling a well, or you're fixing a transmission or changing oil, you have to have a thought process that says, this is important. This is an important job. You have to serve sincerely and work with enthusiasm, because in reality, you're not just working for your employee. You're working for God. You're working for the Lord. He's our ultimate boss. So my second point is, let's consider a character from the Bible that we all know about and have heard of. His name is Daniel. Anybody here not heard of a guy named Daniel back in the Old Testament? About 550 BC, well, that's a long time ago, during the Babylonian captivity. If you remember, Daniel got hauled off to Babylon, and he's enslaved there. He's a bright, good-looking guy, very capable man, and he was in a pretty tough situation. He was in an environment, to say the least, was very difficult. And like I said, Babylon's a long way from Jerusalem. It's a long way. It's probably about from here to, at that time, about from here to Minneapolis. About 900 miles from Minneapolis to Cutbank, and that's how far he got hauled off. And the people that were in Babylon, they were very pagan. I mean, to the nth degree, they were extremely pagan, extremely evil in the belief system. They worshipped other gods. They lived different lives. They had totally different priorities from what he was raised with as a Jew. You see, when Daniel was just a youth, he was taken captive, as I said. He was put into an intensive training program, or I guess you'd call re-education in our idea today. He was put into this, and but then and there, Daniel made up his mind that he was going to follow God. He wasn't going to fall into the Babylonian mindset. So Daniel excelled in that program and in everything else that he did. It was with God's help he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. You remember Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and none of his advisors could even give him any idea what it was about, and Daniel did. He not only told him what his dream was, he told him what the meaning of it was, and he was really a hero with Nebuchadnezzar. And the king got so impressed by all that he made him ruler of the province of Babylon. Here's this slave that's hauled off from Israel, from the Jewish people, all the way to Babylon, and he's over the whole thing. And he was put in charge of all the wise men there, and under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, which was his capital city, was so great in that time. It's hard to comprehend in 540, 550 BC how great Babylon was. It was the world power that rivaled anything of its day. In fact, you probably heard of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Huge, huge, huge. Still to this day, they talk about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world. And according to Herodotus, who was a Greek historian of that day, several colossal gold statues that weighed many tons were there also. But as great a warrior and ruler as he was, Nebuchadnezzar exhibited an even greater pride. He was a great warrior. He was a great thinker, obviously. But he had pride that went way beyond that. So God sent him another dream and images that really terrified him. And Daniel told him that what his dream meant. And that he went on to say that because of your pride, Nebuchadnezzar, God has decided to make you lose your sanity for 7 years. And during those years, if you look at Daniel 4:25, it says, this is those years that Nebuchadnezzar's lost his mind. It says, you will be driven away from people. You will live with wild beasts. You will eat grass just as an ox does. You will become wet with the dew of heavens. Then you will recognize that the Most High God rules over all kingdoms on earth. And all that happened just as Daniel said it would. It all did. You look at the passage. So when he recovered from all this, eating with the animals and being out of his mind, Nebuchadnezzar said in chapter 4, verses 34 and 37, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up toward heaven. My mind became clear again. Then I praised the Most High God. I gave honor and glory to the God who lives for everything. Everything he does is right. All his ways are fair. He is able to bring down those who live proudly. And this is the most godless man in the ancient world. After he spent 7 years out eating grass, he comes to realize that God is who he said he was, the God that we worship today. It was some years later that Daniel had to make another involuntary career decision. The Medes and the Persians. If you look back in ancient history, we see the Medes and the Persians came in and took over the Babylonians. And first of all, they joined forces with the Babylon, and when King Darius set up his new kingdom, Daniel was given a job as one of his 3 chief administrators. So let's pick up that story. We go ahead a couple chapters from what I read earlier to Daniel chapter 6, verse 3 through 5. This is under King Darius. And it says, Daniel did a better job than the other 2 leaders or any of the royal rulers. He was an unusually good and able man, so the king planned to put him in charge of the whole kingdom. But the other 2 leaders and the royal rulers heard about it, so they looked for a reason to bring charges against Daniel. They tried to find something wrong with the way he ran the government, but they weren't able to. They couldn't find any fault with his work. He could always be trusted. He never did anything wrong, and he always did what he was supposed to. Finally, these men said, we want to bring charges against Daniel, but it's almost impossible. If we find a reason, it will have to be in connection with the law of his God, end quote. So this Daniel comes from way far away in Israel to Babylon, and he's excelling above everybody. What did it say about his job performance? He did everything he was supposed to do. He worked hard. He was industrious. He honored God with his work. I don't think he did it for the Babylonians. He didn't think much of the Babylonians. Not really. And I think most of you know the rest of that story. These men were so jealous of Daniel that they cooked up this plan, and what did they do? They tricked Darius into doing what? They had him thrown into the lion's den, didn't he? Yeah. Huh?
It was the prayer.
Yeah, they threw him into the lion's den. And they expected the lions to probably kill Daniel, which is kind of expected if you're thrown into a lion's den. But God, what? God came through and he protected him. If you look at Daniel 6, 19 to 23, it says, as soon as the sun began to rise, so here's Darius. He's all fretting and worried. He didn't sleep good that night. And as soon as the sun came up, he got up, he hurried to the lion's den. And when he got near it, he called out to Daniel. His voice was filled with great concern. Daniel, you serve the living God. You always serve him faithfully. So has he been able to save you from the lions? He's hoping against hope, But it did. Daniel said, yeah, I'm here. I'm doing just fine. Daniel answered, your majesty, may you live forever. My God sent his angel, and his angel shut the mouths of the lion. They haven't hurt me at all. That's because I haven't done anything wrong in God's sight. I've never done anything wrong to you either, your majesty. And then it goes on to say something that's really, I think, instructive for us this morning. It says, quote, the king was filled with joy. He ordered his servants to lift Daniel out of the den. They didn't see any wounds on him. Then King Darius wrote to people of all nations, I order people in every part of my kingdom to respect and honor Daniel's God. He is the living God. He will live forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His rule will never end. He sets people free and saves them. He does miraculous signs and wonders. He does them in the heavens and on the earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. End quote. That's the God we worship this morning. That's the God that we're honoring on Sunday morning. Is that kind of God. So what were the results of Daniel's faithfulness? Okay, he did his job right. He says, I didn't do anything wrong against God, and I didn't do anything wrong against my employer, Darius. Well, not only did Daniel impress King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians, and King Darius of the Medes, who conquered the Babylonians, we're told that he was, as a very old man, he also served well the Persian king that came along. So we had three different empires, I would say, come into play here. You had, first of all, the Babylonians, then you had the Medes and the Persians. And these guys were really bad apples. I mean, they were really bad people. And they took the Jews in and they exploited them. But because of Daniel, one man here, things were changed. King Cyrus was that Persian king who absorbed the Medes into the Persian Empire. So you see, all this comes into play, and all through this period, Daniel is excelling in such a great way. He's making such a good example of himself to these pagan people and these pagan kings. Verse 28 in chapter 6, I believe it is. So Daniel had success while Darius was king. Things went well with Daniel during the rule of Cyrus the Persian. We're in the atomic age, aren't we? They didn't have atomic bombs back 540 BC, but I really believe we're part of the greatest chain reaction the world has ever known. Every one of our lives touches one another. When you think about it, more so than ever before. What did they say? Seven steps between. How does that go? I'm trying to think of something I should have wrote down. But you know, if you go 7 people back that you know, somebody in the world is connected with them in some way. So we're more connected to each other than we realize. A lot more connected. One life touches another. Who touches another, who touches another, and on and on and on. And look at the kings whose lives Daniel directly touched. Nebuchadnezzar, as I said. You had Darius and the Mede and Cyrus the Persian. Each one of these first saw Daniel as a slave. He was a know-nothing guy. He was just an ordinary stiff brought in from Jerusalem, from Israel. But he had God in his heart. He wanted to honor God, and it made all the difference in the world. He was a captive from a small country that was inferior to their own. He didn't worship their God. He wouldn't share their customs. At first glance, he would have been someone to look down on, someone that you would totally ignore. But it wasn't long until nearly everyone around Daniel knew he had different standards. He had higher standards than the world around him. And an absolute devotion and a trust and dedication to his God. And that made him a trustworthy, faithful, and hardworking subject to his king. Now there's an employee that any boss would want. Any boss would be thrilled to have a guy with even half that ethic. And what was the result for him? Daniel. Well, each of these rulers and their subjects gained a whole new perspective. They gained a whole new respect for the God that Daniel served, the true God of heaven and earth. In fact, I think most of them came to the knowledge of his God as being living and active. And on the other hand, their gods of stone or precious metal, and they were not prominent in their lives anymore. So you had the whole Far East, not the Far East. I guess it'd be the Near East, wherever that is. Where's Babylon at? The Near East.
Iran.
Well, Iran, and that's not the Middle East. Oh, I guess it is. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm digressing. But anyway, all those people in the known world at that time, in the famous known world, became knowledgeable of the God of Daniel, the God that we worship today. And they were affected. Their whole cultures were affected by that. Look at just part of that chain reaction I'm talking about here that Daniel set off. During his lifetime, some of the Jews were no longer looked upon as inferior, and they too began to hold important positions in the government in this ancient world. And while King Cyrus was alive, the Jews who wished to were allowed to return to their homeland. You remember that story about Nehemiah and Esther in our Old Testament? They took, under their leadership, under their inspiration by God, guess what? The Jews got to go back to Jerusalem. Esther, became queen of Persia. She's a Jew. Her cousin, Mordecai, became prime minister of Persia. Another generation passed, and we find Nehemiah comes into play, and all the Jews get to go back. He was just a cupbearer and a confidant to the king of Persia, and yet look what happened. God used him in a great mighty way. And they went back to Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And nearly 400 years passed. And what happened 400 years after, let's say 400 BC? 400 BC takes you where? To number 1 BC, and number 180. And what happened then? Okay, we had the birth of a Savior, didn't we? We had Jesus. Jesus was born. The Messiah came. And what happened when he came? What happened as a baby, as a child? We see the nativity scene, right? And we've got, what do we got at the nativity scene? We got the shepherds come.
The 3 kings.
And we got the 3 kings, the 3 wise men. Where did they come from?
From the east.
Oh boy, they came from the east. And they were Christians. 400 years later, Christianity has a stronghold in Babylon. And these 3 kings came to see the newborn king. And it came about because of the witness of one man. It wasn't a whole group, it was one man, Daniel. Daniel stood for God, and he influenced 3 major empires of the ancient world. And we got the wise men come. I really believe, if I look, as I study the life of Nebuchadnezzar, yeah, he was a mean, awful guy, but there's no doubt in my mind that he was a Christian. By the time his death came, he wasn't worshiping these evil gods. He was a Christian. And so we can see that his work ethic, Daniel's work ethic, his ethic and his love toward God and his honoring of God made all the difference in the world of that day and right up to our day. So I hope we've learned something. Let me ask the question of myself as well as you. What are future generations going to say about you? And what are they going to say about me? I think it makes all the difference in the world how we live our lives as to what they're going to say. So if God has spoken to you in any way on this Memorial Day weekend, you do what God tells you to do.